Welcome to this evening's event. My name is Martine Croxall. I'm a presenter with BBC News and a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. The number of children in poverty in the UK is at its highest level since comparative records began in 2002. Figures released by the Department for Work and Pensions show that in the year to April 2024, there were 4.45 million children living in a household of relative low income after housing costs are deducted, and that is the government's own standard measure of poverty. This equates to 31% of children in the UK. What does that mean then for society today and for the health and well-being of the generations to come, that so many children are growing up without secure access to food, housing or opportunities? Well, we're joined by a panel of experts who will reflect on the human cost of child poverty, the causes of it, and the changes they believe are needed to lift families out of financial insecurity. We'll also discuss the biological effects of poverty, something that often gets overlooked. So our panel. Alison Garnham has been Chief Executive of the Child Poverty Action Group since September 2010. And the group, I believe, you're marking your 60th anniversary. Had a get-together today to mark that with Gordon Brown speaking. Prior to this, Alison was the CEO of Daycare Trust and previously for 9 years the Director of Policy at One Parent Families, now Gingerbread. In her early career, she worked for women's organisations and local voluntary sector organisations, and then for nearly 10 years as a welfare rights advisor in Citizens Advice Bureau. Danny Dorling is the 1971 Professor of Geography at the University of Oxford. That's a very interesting title. There must be a story behind that. His work examines issues of inequality, health, housing, education and employment in Britain and internationally. He's written and co-authored numerous influential books, including Inequality and the 1%, Rule Britannia, Brexit and the End of Empire, and more recently, 7 Children. Now, when I was at the university at Leeds, barely any difference in our age, but we all knew Danny Dorling. He was like the rock star of human geography, and here I am, all these years later, embarrassing him on the stage. Helen Rowe is a writer, campaigner and a social policy researcher with a focus on poverty, housing and social justice. She's the author of a book called Eliminating Poverty in Britain, which I highly recommend you read. It offers practical and radical proposals for ending child poverty in the UK. Helen provides local authorities, schools and charities with training on the biology of poverty and child poverty. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here at Lowther Lodge. In a moment we're going to hear from each of our panellists in turn, and then there'll be a group discussion. And then you, our audience, will have a chance to ask your questions. You can post them on the chat function from home, and we will go through them a little bit later. But first, I'm going to invite Alison to take your loose 5 minutes.
Yes.
On your feet or on your seat. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to start with sort of a positive note. Basically, in the UK, we've lifted 1 million children out of poverty before. That was under the last child poverty strategy, under the last Labour government. So the evidence shows that child poverty absolutely responds to public policy. So we've done it before in the UK, we know how to make it happen, we can do it again. And that strategy was very broad-ranging across government. There were increases in tax credits and child benefit, which were really fundamental to the strategy, as well as policies targeted at families with children. We had the first ever Childcare Act, which introduced the full entitlement, the promise of extended schools to national minimum wage, the new deals like the New Below Parents, which doubled below parents charities are getting a job. By the end of the strategy, low parent employment got up from 45 to 57% and then moved on up to 70%. And we had Sure Start educational maintenance allowance. Lots of policies that were new at the time. So that makes me feel optimistic. But now there's an awful lot to do. Families are in a bad place. Child poverty has risen by 900,000 since 2010 to a record 4.5 million or 31% of children. That's 9 in every class of 30 in the UK. And poverty is deeper than ever before. People might not be not just below the line, but a very long way below the line. More than 1 in 5 children are in food insecure schools in a project called The Cost of the School Day. We find children arriving at school hungry, unable to concentrate, they feel less safe, they're more likely to be absent, to experience bullying, experience poor mental health. They can't afford the school equipment they need, they miss out on everyday experiences that make up childhood like school trips. They return to cold homes, and none of this is inevitable. We've actually been living through, in the last 14, 15 years, through a historic poverty-producing period, during which benefits rose with inflation for working-age families only 5 times in the 14 years of the austerity period. The rest of the time they were frozen or of sub-inflation increase. Over that period, there were over 50 cuts to benefits and tax credits after 2010. We now spend $50 billion a year less on social security for working-age families than we would have done without those cuts. We don't need to look where the bodies are going, they're in plain sight. We've seen the growth of the food bank movement from about 40 food banks to over 2,000. And that happened precisely over that period. So as people's incomes fell, destitution increased. So the good news is there's now a manifesto commitment to reduce child poverty within this Parliament. PM says it's his moral mission, and it's been 15 months since that strategy was announced, and we've been working really closely with government. They have fully engaged with people. We've made sure that they also engage with low-income families. So as part of a project called Changing Realities, so it's made up of low-income families on benefits, and they've been to number 10. They've talked to the people on the child poverty strategy. So it's been a good process. And there's been some small bits of progress in terms of policy. There was a reduction in the amount that could be taken from universal credit for debt payments. There's more spending on health and education, more money for SEN and breakfast clubs. There was the branded uniform issue in the Education and Wellbeing in Schools Bill, increasing the earnings limit for carers allowance, extension of the household support fund. I mean, England is still the only UK nation that has no uniform costs, which is, for example, there are in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And the other really big good news is that we now have free school meals from next year for all children in families on universal credit. That's real progress. I mean, ideally we want universal free school meals. It's something we've been campaigning for 60 years. I think when we were founded 60 years ago, we wanted free school meals, national minimum wage and child benefit. And we thought we'd all be going home after a year, and all sorted. Anyway, 6 years later, here we are. But we also need things like extended schools, after-school activities, holiday childcare, as promised by the last Labour government, and universal high-quality childcare. So a new strategy needs to be across government. There are levers to pull right across government, like there were last time. We need to look at education, childcare, health, housing, employment and jobs, of course, because a lot of the problem here is to do with the quality of jobs that people are in. 70% of poor children live with working parents. So the issue is low wages. The issue is wages that don't keep people out of poverty. It's not about unemployment as it was back in the late 90s, for example. So we think the strategy has to start from a clear analysis of what child poverty is. Families with children are not just one of the groups of poor people. They're poor precisely because their parents are children. And they're less able to work, they can supply fewer hours, they have additional cost of children, need more space to live in. The cost of children and the time cost of caring are fundamental to any understanding of why child poverty exists and how it must be tackled. That's why we need that broad range of policies. And what we've been saying to government, 3 things. First, we need to remove the cuts that are driving child poverty up, and we know what they are. Second, we need to invest in the policies that will prevent and reduce child poverty. And third, we need to imagine a society with no child poverty and develop a strategy to eliminate it. And that's not difficult. There are countries who do a lot better than we do, and there's a lot to look at. So yes, levers across government, but what they must do as a first step, and we're still battling to get the first of these things that I mentioned achieved, because the 2 policies driving up child poverty at the moment are the 2-child limit and the benefit cap. Our cost of a child research this year again shows that while a first child comes with slightly higher costs than its siblings, subsequent children, there are no notable economies of scale, they cost just the same. So the idea that going around governments at the moment that we could taper off the 2-child limit and that would work doesn't make any sense at all. There might be an odd saving from hand-me-down clothes or whatever, but things like childcare, food, housing costs don't change. So we don't think there's any case for a benefit system that doesn't recognise the cost of each child or that arbitrarily caps support. Children deserve a childhood free of poverty, no matter how many brothers and sisters they have. So it's bitterly disappointing that so far the government hasn't taken the decision to get rid of the two-child benefit cap, but it's obviously something that's being hotly debated at the moment, and we're going to find out what gets announced in the budget. If they get rid of it, it would instantly lift 400,000 children out of poverty, and another 1 million children would be in less deep poverty. That's something that's really, to be prayed for. It's our top campaign at the moment. It's so important. It's the biggest driver of poverty at the moment. More than 100 children are pulled into poverty every day because of the two-child limit. So scrapping it is the only cost-effective way of doing that. There's no more straightforward value for money way of doing it. And also, against the backdrop of almost 50 billion less being spent on social security, it's the bare minimum this strategy must do. We also know that child poverty is very expensive. It costs about 40 billion a year according to calculations done by Rowe University. Just two more points. One is the reason why money and income is so crucial to this debate is that we know from tens of thousands of studies that family income has a causal relationship with poor child outcomes, that poor children have worse cognitive, educational development, social, emotional behaviour and health outcomes, including birth outcomes and life expectancy. And this is independent of any other factors like household and parental characteristics. The most likely mediating factor is parental stress and anxiety. And the size of these effects are really large. And in a lot of these studies, if you give families more money, the outcomes improve. It's as simple as that. So, to conclude, investing in children and families is money really well spent. We know that child poverty is policy responsive, and we can look at what's just happened in Scotland. Child poverty fell in Scotland last year to 22% from 26% the year before because of the Scottish Child Payment. So children in Scotland are having better outcomes because they're getting more money. So we need leadership, binding targets, more resources and investment in social security. Thank you.
Alison, thank you very much. And the thing is as well, kids know, don't they, when their circumstances are different?
Of course they do.
Like,
and they know their parents are struggling.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Helen, all yours.
Thank you. I've got some slides. I've only got 5 slides with luck. Forward. It might come up. Let's see. Back again. Okay. Child poverty is very, very, very geographical. So we've already heard that Scotland has managed to reduce child poverty, usually in just the most recent year. But ever since it brought in the Scottish Child Payment in the middle of the pandemic, as it realised that this was the next crisis after the pandemic, it's the cost of living crisis. Countries tend to care most about poverty and child poverty when they're most equal. So the campaign to end child poverty in Britain was established at the time that the UK was most equal. It's when hope is high. When countries become very unequal, and I'm going to show you in a minute just how unequal we are, people live parallel lives. They tend not to know about the lives of others, and when you ask them about other people, they'll more often tell you that folk are poor because they're feckless, and their children are poor because people are feckless. We did this in the past in Victorian times. We learned not to do it by the 1960s and 70s. We're starting to do it again. Most of Europe doesn't do it. This book was one of many attempts to try to explain to people just how big inequality is. The first 7 bars are proportional to the average disposable income of 7 equal children across the income scale. The last bar is the kind of people who buy books, who almost always are better off than the family of the seventh child. I think the key thing to tell you to sort of spoil the book is that child number 7, typical of the best of 2 million children out of 4 million that we have, 14 million that we have. Child number 7 in the middle of that, she's called Gemma. Her mum and dad run a corner shop. They bring home after tax £50,000 a year. That's your rich kid. If your mum and dad have got more than £50,000 a year in disposable income, you're off the scale. And that group, and I'm in it, that group of us who are off the scale, above child number 7, we're taking a third of all national income a year. Inequality creates poverty. Here's a couple of quotes for you. Bloomberg and the Financial Times, which, interestingly, over time, some things get better, they've become more progressive as news organisations, but the news is bad if you read the quotes. The poorest fifth of households in this country are now poorer than more of the poorest fifth in absolute terms, have less stuff, have worse housing, can't buy as good food as the poorest fifth in most of Eastern Europe. So the UK has become a peripheral country. But because we live our own lives, those of us who are affluent simply don't notice this has occurred. First set of graphs for you. The weekly lines are the official international measure of income inequality. Now, we're very fortunate in the UK that Bulgaria exists. Because if Bulgaria didn't exist, we would be definitely the most unequal country in Europe. But, bar Bulgaria, inequality in incomes, which is what drives poverty, is highest in the United Kingdom. Of all European countries, I'm showing quite a lot there. It's the driver. You cannot reduce and get rid of poverty without reducing the gaps between people's income. It doesn't work. Mention was made earlier about how other countries do better than us. The second graph here is United Nations' latest estimate of the change in child poverty for every single country that they measure in the same way, mainly rich countries. And in one sense, this graph above my head is good news, and it shows what's possible. The majority of countries have seen falls in child poverty in 7 years to about 2022. Huge falls in some cases. Poland, Slovenia, Latvia, Lithuania. Korea, which is a poster country for inequality. If you think about Parasite and movie or Squid Games, huge drop, 30% drop. Estonia, Canada, Romania, Portugal, Croatia, Japan, Ireland, Malta, Greece, Belgium, New Zealand, and Scotland. Even the United States at this period, it's got worse now, has dropped. Sweden, Colombia, Netherlands, all drops. Okay? Now you probably looked up to the top, and somebody always has to do worse, but it's the UK at the top has had the biggest rise in the most recent 7-year period that the United Nations body that measures child poverty has reported. Right? You can't do worse than that. You can't be worse than have the worst record in the world according to the UN on your trend of child poverty. What's even more appalling is that those countries just beneath us, Iceland, France, Switzerland and Norway, which have had a 10% rise, have had a 10% rise on some of the lowest levels ever recorded in human history. So it's bad, but they're still miles better than we are. I won't go on about it, I'll just think. And people don't know this. People don't know this because we're an unequal country, and so we don't actually care at the moment enough about it. What else happens when you're an unequal country? We'd have to know there's only one more graph, I think, coming. It's often said that taxes are at a 70-year high, and they are. We're the red line, that's public spending as a portion of GDP, which is very similar to taxation, give or take borrowing. And the red line is now higher than it was in the 1980s when it began. There's a couple of blips, the banking crisis in 2008 and the pandemic. All countries have to spend more. I've missed out Ireland and Switzerland because they have slightly odd economies. And if you miss those out in Europe, we are by far the lowest public spending, lowest tax country. No Chancellor of the Exchequer ever explains this to the population in their budget. None of them go. We're going to increase your taxes a bit, but they're still going to be much lower than in Germany or France or in Italy or in Spain. So the scope the scope to do things is absolutely enormous. The question is, why on earth have we got into that position of being at the bottom of the league table for improving child poverty, and at the bottom of the league table for raising money through taxation to do public good? Last graph, politics. And this isn't in the 7 Children book, it's more recent. It's what's happened according to the British election study to voters since the election to a period 12 months after. And it's chaos. We've never had volatility like this before. We probably won't get it again, because whenever you're at a maximum, it doesn't end. Labour's managed to lose half its vote in just 12 months. But most of that has gone to, I don't know how to vote, and Liberals and the Greens. Hasn't gone to reform. Let's skip out Liberals, about the same, but huge churn. Greens have got bigger, and they've got bigger since then, but not big enough to have a huge effect because their vote is concentrated. Don't knows are roughly the same size, but a load of don't knows has gone to reform. Reform has got bigger, but only because it's got from don't knows, it's got the red ball seats, and from Conservatives. And the Conservative Party has managed to lose almost half its support in just 12 months, which is spectacular because it was at an all-time low to begin with. It's all over the place. Anything could happen. You can't know what's going to happen in the next election. If you want to be optimistic about that graph, if you add up Reform and Conservatives, you'll see they're just slightly bigger than they were at the time of the election, and opposition parties always do better just after they've lost. That's all my slides. Child poverty and inequality are a political argument. This government can aid reform, can talk about how much it doesn't like migrants. It'll probably lose if it does that. Or we can start talking about things that actually matter, and people might well appreciate that.
Thank you, Danny. You say that it's a political matter, but what's the value in emphasising the moral aspects of it?
The problem is that the moral's political. So Victorian morality was traditionally you don't deserve to have it if you don't work hard enough. And the poor are feckless and lazy, and we need to starve them into working.
But there were also some massive charities that got started in Victoria.
Yep, there was a campaign. I mean, famously in London, there was a businessman called Charles Booth who didn't believe there was poverty, and so funded a survey, and then found out that 30% of Londoners were living in poverty. But we're not quite as bad as we were then.
That's a low bar.
But, well, we're back to 1930s levels of inequality. And if you think about the 30s, it's the time of Brideshead Revisited, it's houses with servants, huge inequalities in living standards. 1 in 3 of our children doesn't have a summer holiday anymore at all. 1 in 3. We used to almost all have summer holidays back in the 70s and early 1980s. And we've kind of accepted it. And growing numbers of parents, when they're asked, don't just say we didn't have a summer holiday, but they tick a box that says, we don't need one. My kids don't need a holiday.
For the family life.
Yeah.
Helen.
Thank you very much. As ever, incredibly interesting stuff. I'm going to look at this from a different perspective. So this is... there we go. Oh, hang on. Sorry. There we go. So I'm a biologist, and I've been writing in a book about the latest scientific and social research on how poverty affects the body, and in this case we're talking about children's bodies. So when I did my biology degree from the early noughties, it was kind of basic biology 101, that species develop through random changes in the DNA. And if that change was useful, so if it was like a new camouflage, that species would go on to develop, and if it wasn't useful, it would die out. So biology 101, it was all random. We now know that actually that isn't the case, and there are 2 main areas of research that have changed that. So the neuroscience of poverty, so it affects the brain, and epigenetics, so how your DNA is affected by your environment. Now if you think of the brain, it kind of looks a bit like that, got 2 hemispheres on either side. The grey matter on the outside is what you would think of as your brain cells, so that's your learning, listening, emotions. And on the inside you've got the white matter, and that's your connective tissue, so the whole thing can kind of talk to itself and act as one organ. Both If she doesn't eat royal jelly, nothing happens. So it's her environment that determines which bits of her DNA are turned on and which are turned off. And we know this is also the case in turtles' nests. So it's the temperature of the nest that determines whether the turtles will come out male or female. So the environment plays a massive impact on how your DNA works. And this is the case obviously in animals, it's also for humans therefore, and particularly for children. And for kids, it's about stress, which is what Alison was talking about earlier. But there's life stress, like exams and so on, and then there's poverty-related stress, which is quite different. And there are three key areas. So one is, unsurprisingly, longevity, and the fact that it becomes intergenerational, that this stress can last for decades. Malnutrition is another one. Danny produced some stats recently talking about the fact that our children in Britain are getting shorter, and a lot of that's to do with malnutrition. And then the other one, which people do not talk about, is the shame of living in poverty and what that does to your brain. And there's some really good statistics. The Spirit Level was a massive book when it came out a few years ago, and they've done a lot of statistics to show how shame changes the way people behave. Now for kids, obviously the human body is one structure, but I'm going to kind of break it down because it'll be easy to understand. So for children, stress is the issue, and the body has three main reactions. So inflammation, the trauma response, the fight, flight, freeze response, and then obviously for kids it's brain development. Now one of those issues that they found is when children grow up in cold homes, that has a big impact on their ability to sleep, and that specific thing changes the microstructure of the white matter, so the connecting tissue. So they did brain scans of over 2,000 kids between the ages of 9 and 12, and they saw that the white matter doesn't mature in the way that it should for kids growing up in poverty and in cold homes. There's also been some really interesting research done recently about the insular cortex changes in the brain. So if we think about the brain, so this bit here, the front bit, is the prefrontal cortex. So that's like your chief executive of the brain, tells everything what to do. Further back, you've got your numbers and your spellings, and then at the back, you've got the occipital lobe, which is your vision, so it goes straight through from your eyes to the back. Then cerebellum at the bottom, which is like dancing, motor skills. Brainstem, which is the oldest part of the brain, that's what we share with all other living organisms. And right in the middle, you've got the temporal lobe. And that's memory, speech, emotions, and everything. Like that. The insular cortex sits right in the middle. It's like a big wiggly worm in the middle of it. And it's a hub for a whole load of things, but particularly emotional hub. And it's got your inflammation memory in there. So it affects the immune system as well as the emotions. And what they found is that as you age, as to normal persons at our age, the insular cortex gets shorter, and that's quite natural. And what they've found is that it changes shape as children grow up in poverty. So for girls, it matures faster. So they have, but for boys, it matures slower. So what you end up with is someone who is the size of a man, but with the emotional range of someone who's much, much younger. And when we think about things like the direct link between serious youth violence, like stabbings on our streets, there's a direct link with poverty. Actually, you can see it in the brain, how it would function. The fact that you've got that shame, you've got those emotions on the streets, and kids end up doing things that they don't mean to. Other issues is that with poverty and cold homes, the body reacts in either hypersensitive or hyposensitive ways. And so children who grow up in poverty are far more likely to have asthma because the body is already quite stressed. And if you are a child, so at the moment you've got about 1 in 11 kids, so that's about 2 or 3 children per class have got asthma. This is a very high rate compared to Europe, again, unsurprisingly, given Danny's data. Around 20,000 hospital admissions a year. But if you grow up and you are living in a poorer area, you've got a 4 times greater chance of dying from an asthma attack than you would if you were living in a less deprived area. And also because the body attacks itself, you're more likely to have things like childhood arthritis and then inflammation, chronic inflammation going into adulthood as well. And the NHS, unsurprisingly, then has to pick all that up and deal with it. With mental health, we found with research that for pregnant mothers who are living in poverty, highly stressed, not getting the nutrition that they need, they have high stress levels and cortisol levels, and that moves through the umbilical cord into the unborn child. And what you have is a child that then is born with far higher stress levels than they would normally have. And this means that this affects their temporal lobe, that bit right in the middle of the brain, that's to do with language processing, that has a huge impact on their educational ability. But it also means if they do get into trouble, it's much harder to deal with depression and anxiety. They're more stressed, so they're more likely to move into post-traumatic stress if something major happens in their lives. They're also more likely to have addiction. Now, addiction is not the problem in itself, it's the coping mechanism to the underlying stress. So it could be food, so we have a problem with obesity, with children who are comfort eating, but there's also issues around smartphones. They're designed for addiction, but then if you also want to get away mentally from the environment that you're in, smartphones are a really easy way of doing that. So it's a kind of double whammy. So when people talk about, we're going to have a sugar tax to prevent children from eating lots of sugar, it's not going to do anything, pretty much, compared to what you really need to do, which is deal with poverty. And then there's traumatic brain injuries. Again, something that doesn't get a lot of knowledge or discussions about. So you can have these in a number of ways. They're basically a bit of a bruise on the brain, car accidents, there's a lot of issues around rugby and sport, but also child abuse. And if children have a lot of minimal, or sort of minor hits to the brain, that can then lead to a larger issue with traumatic brain injury. In the UK, you've got about 5% of people have TBIs. In prison, for men, it's about 85%. For women, it's 96%, because they've normally experienced violence before they've gone into jail. So you can see then how the link is with crime and with violence. And then, of course, when you're talking about a brain that is in the trauma response long term, then what it does is it freezes the sections needed for learning, listening, and emotional control. And so that leads to problems in school and the ability to deal with the work environment. And of course, what really happens in our society is that if you can cope with more stress, you tend to get paid more, you're doing more stressful jobs. And so that means that you're more likely to live in poverty if you can't do that already, because you're already maxed out, what we call the allostatic load, which is your emotional capacity level. All the politicians talk about wanting to reduce national health waiting times, crime, education, the economy. But as I talk about in the book, if you don't deal with poverty, none of these things are going to get materially better. So that's why, one of the reasons why I wrote the book, and there's just so much statistics now and knowledge coming out from the scientific community about how poverty affects children's bodies.
Helen, thank you very much. As a biologist, when you were doing all this research, what was the thing that was most arresting for you to discover?
It was the insular cortex, the changes, the fact that the brain literally changes as you age, and particularly the teenage stabbings, because that link hasn't really been made. It's quite a jump, you know. I've kind of made that, but I looked at the statistics and I looked at the brain, and you just think. It's kind of obvious that if young men, and my daughter's in primary school, she's just coming out of primary school, and some of the boys are enormous, they dwarf me. And you think, well, if you're that size physically, but emotionally you're seriously underdeveloped, it's going to have a massive impact. And the politicians just don't. What I find is there's the science community doing all this research, and then there's the politicians and the policy wonks, for a better word, doing the policy, and the two just aren't connected.
Ooh, where have you seen that before?
So that's why I do
boys and girls as well.
The difference between boys and girls, yeah. And I do wonder whether part of it is one of the reasons why girls tend to have teenage pregnancies. And something I haven't covered in this is kind of touch hunger, because if you're growing up in poverty, children in our country don't get hugged anywhere near as much as they do in other societies. And so actually I wonder whether for girls,
if they are feeling more mature but they're not getting the touch, sexual relationships come and provide that, but they're not necessarily going to have the emotions to deal with a lot of it.
And the consequences.
Thank you all. Alison, a child I was reading today is said to be living in poverty if they live in a household with income below 60% of the national average or median income. That's from your website. Why do we measure child poverty?
So there's interesting history of this, really. I mean, partly to do with my organisation. I mean, we coined the term child poverty in 1965. It was partly in reaction to the appalling attitudes towards low-income families in the 60s. There's a lot of prejudice. So it was like a reframing of the issue. What are we really concerned about here? We're concerned about what happens to children in these families. So we became the Child Poverty Act. We met in March, and by December we were the Child Poverty Action Group. We've been kind of the family income group or something. So child poverty arose out of that. It's a way of focusing attention on what, all the things that we're talking about here is like who really matters. At the middle of this is 4.5 billion children who have no power at all. They have no voice, they have no vote, and yet they're 100% of our future. It's not good enough for our society to ignore this. It's positively dangerous for all sorts of reasons. I do get a bit concerned about some of the stuff about, there's an element, a potential element of parent blaming can come into some of these debates. I'm familiar with it from the early years stuff where you talk about, a child under the age of 3, this development in that stage is so critical for the child. But it's almost like saying after that, well, hopeless, isn't it? Because it isn't, is it? So some of the biological explanations, you have to be really cautious with them, it seems to me.
Yeah. And I do talk, I spoke to the child poverty unit about this, saying actually you need to look at family poverty, not just children, because for kids to live with stressed parents is, you might have enough food on the table, but if it's impacting the parents' mental health, then it's got to be
exactly.
Unit.
So one of the things we were dealing with back in the 60s was all this debate. There was all the debate about maternal deprivation. So children were doing badly. They were accusing the mothers of being to blame for it. So nowadays we're talking about the importance of early years, which is quite right. There's really strong evidence for the UK that high quality provision, early years education, nursery education, leads to much improved outcomes for children, and the effects are the most long-lasting for the most disadvantaged children. But only if it's high quality. So any old childcare won't do.
You're not corralling kids, are you?
No, that's not what it's for, exactly.
So there's no shortage of data, Danny. Your graphs show it beautifully. We've had tons of data. What happens to all of it? It's all very well collecting it, but you've got to do something with it.
This is the problem, and it's huge. We know you're saying about school meals. At the time you want it. Finland already had them in the 60s for all children. So it's just called food at school.
Of course.
Everybody got it. And childcare in Finland, nursery education, you've got to have a master's degree to be a nursery nurse.
The professional pedagogue is a degree-level qualification.
I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but there are another set of people, let's just call them economists, well not quite, but there are a set of folk who these kind of things for them are less important.
Because some people are seen as economic units.
Growth is the most important. If we get growth, it'll rise all the ships and it'll trickle down and it'll help everybody else. They're completely wrong. But if you're trying to understand how can we ignore all this evidence, it's because there are people who think this is terribly unimportant compared to getting richer, growth, or even this is a bit namby-pamby and a bit cuddling, and just a small stiff upper lip and go out and they're wrong. But if you want a good... So there's a breadline survey of poverty which has been taken around the world where you ask parents and everybody, what should people be able to have? Should a child have a warm winter coat? Everybody says yes. There's always an item which is 50-50, like a smartphone. Always every time that becomes, of course, you need a smartphone. You can't be a child without one, age 11. We can't...
Not social media. You mustn't go on social media.
Mustn't go there. We can't run the breadline surveys in the United States because you can't actually present adults in the United States with what should every child have as a set of questions, because too many adults will tell you they shouldn't have anything if their parents can't afford it. And that's a cultural change, a difference. And there's a danger, we're miles away from it now, but if Britain was to become more unequal and more callous, we could get to a point where adults say children shouldn't have what their parents can't provide, and if their parents can't provide, they shouldn't have the children. And I worry about this because when I was young, if people talked about deporting certain people to other countries, we used to call them racist, and now that gets talked about in public discourse. So things can get worse, and we've got to stop them getting worse and then work out what on earth do we do so we're not leading the European League table of worst record in change in child poverty.
Sorry, I was just going to say, and that I completely agree, and it's one of the reasons why I like the science, because it backs up this idea against the concept of the undeserving poor, which is exactly what Danny's kind of been talking about. Because I've had people saying, well, if you wanted it hard enough, I can do the whole talk. I've spoken for 2 hours on the topic, and then people have come out with that at the end. It's so deeply ingrained in people's minds.
Just convince them
blaming people
because we're waiting for this much delayed child poverty strategy from the government. We thought we'd have it by now for this event. What does convince people? Because if politicians are going to formulate a strategy that embeds all of this stuff, they've then got to sell it to the electorate. Because politicians want to be re-elected.
It's shocks, or the anecdote is it's various shocks that occur. So the men fighting in the First World War ending up in shell holes with men of a completely different social class and discovering that they were just like them, whereas you didn't in the past. Books coming out round about £1 a week, just over 100 years ago, describing how people did live on £1 a week and how they weren't feckless. Cinema, films, Cathy Comes Home. There was a large number of heavy-hitting books and films, late 50s, early 60s, which shocked people. And
a little bit, I mean, it's a different subject, but a little bit like the TV series Adolescence, got people talking, didn't they, about the sort of the effects that social media and society is having on boys and their attitudes to girls. Yeah. So where's that shock going to come from?
I think, to be honest, you just need really good leadership and to really kind of just make it very black and white and have Prime Minister of a country saying, you know what, this is unacceptable, and take the heat. But you stand by your morals. And the other thing is education, is around showing people what happens when you live in poverty and what the poverty trap is. And I talk about in the book about the government policies that create and maintain people's poverty. And if you talk about it in that way, you can see that this is a system that has so many barriers, but it's ingrained within the policies. And I remember one of them when Cameron was in charge and all the austerity was kicking in. And one of them was the idea that they made changes with universal credit, where if 2 people were on universal credit, it only went into one person's bank account. Sure. And normally that's going to be the man's, particularly if it's not an equal relationship. And there was a thing sort of saying, well, if you're in a situation of domestic violence, that's only going to make your life worse. And on the government website, it literally said, this is a private matter. That's what it's like. I was really looking at it going, you cannot be serious.
But there is that, there's a lot of that though, isn't there? People don't want to be seen to be intruding on people's private lives. Discussions that we've had here in the past about sort of population growth and population size around the world, and if anyone mentions, well, maybe people should have fewer children, there's a kind of a collective gasp, and no, we mustn't tell people that, because Alison, there will be people who will say, well, I only had 1 child because I knew I couldn't afford more, so why is this family having 3 or 4? Yeah. And yet you're now saying we should remove the benefits cap, we should remove the 2-child limit. A lot of people are going to take a lot of persuading that is a good idea, because they feel that they've gone without, they've made sensible choices, they've been responsible. Why should other people not do the same?
So that was the previous government's argument why it was introducing this policy.
We also wanted to get people to work, didn't it?
Yeah, but remember this was a period when we were being told about strivers and skivers, about the people who were laying in the morning with their curtains closed, when they'd probably been out on a shift. There are hardly any people in this country who don't move into work. 90% of people move off job seeker allowance within 9 months. There's only 10% of people left, and those are people with serious difficulties. The miraculous thing about this country is that British people keep throwing themselves at the labour market. The problem is the labour market doesn't lift them out of poverty. They're going into jobs that are very poorly paid, that are very insecure. 70% of poor children live with working parents. And the point about the two-child limit is 60% of people affected by it are working. So they are precisely the same families that George Osborne talked about. They're making decisions about family size, when they can afford it. But the nature of our labour market is you don't stay in that position for very long. You get turfed out of your job. Jobs are short term. You lose hours. You can't get enough hours. If you go to, stand outside Sainsbury's and look at the jobs. You can get a job for 10 hours, or you can get a job for 12 hours or 15. You can't have two. It's really, really difficult for people in this economy to actually improve their situation. And that's what they're dealing with.
One kind of useful thing for social scientists, or not for society, because we've done these things, and because we've got the USA, which is worse, we can measure it. If we'd been a better country, we wouldn't know. So in terms of the two-child limit, we know it has not prevented anybody from having a child, right? Because we've measured it since. And okay, you could have said nobody sits down and goes, "Oh, hold on, calculated my benefits in future, it's not worth it." But we've actually monitored and measured it since the two-child limit came in, and it turns out it's had no effect on the number of births that people have. So it doesn't stop people having babies, which is lucky, because we haven't produced enough babies since the 1960s.
Yeah.
And the people
What do you want? How do you? You've got to decide what you want and what you're prepared to support.
Okay. The people we're talking about are low-paid workers who receive universal credit as a top-up to their wages. So people imagine, when they hear the benefit system, they think, oh, everybody's out to work. That's not what our benefit system is. It's an in and out of work benefit system. So most of the people we're talking about are working in low-paid work. It's not enough to live on. So they're topped up by universal credit. They can't get better off because of the poverty trap. So if you increase your earnings, you lose 55 pence in every pound that you earn. This is the highest tax group of people in the country. And until your wages break through the universal credit level, you don't get any better off. So these changes, this is why this poverty-producing period that I talk about is so critical. We went through 14 years where the benefits for working-age families did not increase, only 5 times by real inflation in 14 years.
Except for in Scotland. In Scotland, where
only recently. Yeah.
Only recently.
Yeah.
But it's brilliant in Scotland. We're not talking about Norway or Finland. This is part of the UK. Yeah. In Scotland, if you've got a family of 3 and you're on universal credit or credit of any kind, which is about 2 out of 7 children, you get about an extra £4,000 a year.
Yeah.
No child need go hungry or cold in Scotland, and it's not tapered.
Yeah.
And
how do they afford it?
They tax people like me a couple of % more.
They made a political decision.
Yeah. So university professors, hospital consultants, and a few business people, most of them don't do as well. They're taxed a bit more in Scotland.
Yes.
And Scotland has the lowest rate of child poverty in Britain. When I was young, it had the highest. So, and it's partly political. Labour and the Scottish National Party have quietly agreed not to argue about this. And there's not a lot of money, so there's other things that they would like to do, but because there are fewer and fewer children born every year, ending poverty in Scotland is possible, and they're doing it. But they're doing
that in itself is a problem, not having enough children before, isn't it?
That's a bigger
later on.
Yes.
But that was your earlier question, wasn't it? Yeah. People choosing to have small families.
Yeah.
We have very small families in this country. We don't replace ourselves. We have, we used to be, I remember when I worked at one-parent families, it was couples with children generally had about 1.8, 1.9 children. It's now 1.4,
Yeah.
We don't know when they replace
There's
ourselves.
like 800 primary schools are going to close in London in the next 4 years because people they're not hearing kids, they're not having kids, and they can't get into London. So you close the primary schools, then you have to close secondary schools, then you have to start closing universities. Then you don't have a productive economy, but you've managed to save a little bit of money, making a child cold or hungry. I mean, it's ridiculous.
You talked about some of it in the graph when we had that flow chart of what the consequences were of not dealing with the biology of poverty. If a politician's got to sell the idea of eradicating or eliminating poverty, and child poverty in particular, what would the benefits be? Not just to the if you can't sell it on the basis of, well, morally it's right because you don't want a child growing up in poverty, and I can't imagine that many people would say yes, it's right that a child does grow up in poverty, even if you don't like the solutions. What are the consequences to society and to the public purse, if you like,
they are
of there not being a biology of poverty?
Yeah, they're immense, and because nobody's really done it fully, we can't say completely. But, you know, we only have two options with the NHS. We either continue to pour money in it that we don't have, because we're based on debt, or you deal with demand. So poverty makes people sick. Yeah. It's not complicated. Yeah. And so if everybody wants lower waiting times in the NHS, that will be a consequence of dealing with poverty. You know, and then the crime, and you know, you want economic growth? Well, people who are living in poverty spend the extra money in their local areas. Yeah. They're not going on big fancy holidays abroad, spending the money in other countries. They're spending it here. That's how an economy grows. So everybody gets what they want in the long term if you first focus on poverty. Yeah. But I think for too long it's been put in the too difficult to deal with box. You know, it's kind of, it's complicated, it's big, it's messy, and it would take an awful lot of focus. But when you look at the impact of how fast government can work during the COVID years, you know, actually, if you properly focus on the topic, you can do immense things.
My goodness, we spent a lot of money, and everyone was surprised that Rishi Sunak was prepared to do it.
Yeah, okay, but you could say, well, okay, let's do less fraud, you know, less of the Michelle Moan and all that kind of stuff, and getting all the money back. But also, you won't have all the waste. Like, you look at the Ministry of Defence, they spent £660 million on a set of tanks that never materialised. If you have proper focus, you won't have that kind of waste. You know, same with like Boris Johnson's garden bridge, 43 million.
You're dealing with a very different area of government, aren't you? You know, the defence budget just doesn't butt up with, you know, the welfare budget. And I know it's about choices across the piece. I read that there was a YouGov poll in 2023 that showed that 60% of the public supported the child benefit limit. But then other research suggests that they wanted a more equal society. They wanted better income support for working parents. And you mentioned Finland in particular, amongst other countries. We're never going to become Finland, are we? Culturally, we're so far away from what Finland is, aren't we? Even if that's it, I mean, I didn't know that's an aspiration.
I'm laughing because 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago, we were the richest place on earth. You know, the richest centre of the biggest empire the world's ever known. And
but
Finland,
massive inequality.
But being that rich allows you to do things like start an NHS. It wasn't just because we had a clever government. Actually, of all free political views, we were rich enough to start an NHS. Finland was the poorest ex-colony in Europe. You know, it was a colony of Russia, a colony of Sweden, a colony of Denmark, and so on. And to be sitting in the RGS and saying we'll never be as good as Finland, given, you know, and it shows what's possible.
I said we'll never be like Finland. I didn't put a judgment on a value judgment on that.
You mean the high taxes?
It's relatively unpublic taxes, we consider these taxes. No, I mean, I wouldn't aim for Finland. I would aim to be like Germany. It's tricky culturally because people go, but all easier than the Netherlands. And the Netherlands is dramatically more equal than we are. Their 1% take less than half of what our 1% take.
Does it help though that they're much smaller countries?
Well, Germany isn't, and it's much more equal. France is even more equal than Germany, and it's large. It's not about cohesion. There's always this myth of, you know, we are the most cosmopolitan, diverse, highest immigration country in Europe, thanks to that empire. Right? We have, but it takes somewhere like Finland. They're now welcoming their second city, reaching a new population height, thanks to the immigrants, which they thank, because it's good that, you know, they're just ahead of time. Because it's not just here that we're having less children. Peak baby in the world was 1990. There's a little peak 20 years later, 2010. It's going down like this. Right? The world is actually going to have less children in future, but we don't need to artificially accelerate the rate to which that is occurring. Countries swap positions over time. They don't always stay where they are. And the great thing is, we are not going to be at the bottom of the league table in 10 or 20 years' time, because it's impossible. It costs a lot of money to be as bad as that. Mainly tax breaks and giving money to the very, very best off and not taxing them. And originally not taxing non-doms, letting people own multiple houses. We're slowly crawling back on that. We're finally taxing private schools VAT. Right? We slowly are, in some ways, making ourselves more normal, from a European point of view.
I just want to look ahead, because on November the 26th we've got the budget coming. We don't know what's coming. There could be tax rises of some sort. We don't know whether the two-child benefit cap is going to disappear or be changed in some way. And I came across a quote today from Sir Stephen Timms, the Disabilities Minister. He said, "We're considering all available levers to give every child the best start in life as part of our strategy," which again we have to see. He said, "The commitments in the 2025 spending review and since, including the extension of free school meals, eligibility to children, all children, as you mentioned, and families are receiving universal credit, are key steps in our plan for change to put extra pounds in people's pockets and a down payment on the child poverty strategy, building on the expansion of free breakfast clubs, national minimum wage boost and the cap on universal credit deductions through the fair repayment rate." How adequate are they? I think I know what you're going to say. How adequate are they alone without the removal of benefits caps that you've referred to?
The difficulty is that we're struggling to work. I mean, if people, as I said earlier, people often say early years. You can make a lot of difference with high quality early years. But it's vital. The input from early years isn't the only thing in a child's life. The biggest factor in their life is what they call the home learning environment. And that's the child growing up in poverty. People often say things like we want to address the root causes. And so we want to invest in things like early years in schools there. They're not the root cause. Lack of money is the root cause. And you're trying to make these policies work when they're facing into headwinds that will mean they won't work. So you have to do both. And the last government child poverty strategy, they invested a lot in tax credits and child benefit. And 1 million children were lifted out of poverty.
The question a lot of people will ask is, given that we keep being told there are all these black holes of billions and billions of pounds in the public spending pot, tax rises are going to affect a lot of people, Danny, aren't they? Who already, whether they want benefits or not, feel like they're struggling. Feel like they're working really, really hard and they're not getting anywhere, and life's getting worse. And why am I bothering? And when is it ever going to get any better? Yeah. And if the government increases tax, they're going to feel that's even worse. Yeah. And politicians are going to lose favourability, popularity. And you've got to sell the idea of what you're going to do with that tax. If
they don't do more revision, they will. The remarkable thing is that people earning £50,000 a year don't think they're getting enough, even though 90% of people aren't getting that. Remember, only half the adult population pays income tax, right? So we always get these things wrong. People earning 100 grand think they're not getting enough. People earning 200. And the more unequal and divided we become as a society, the more fearful people are. I just walked through Kensington here at school leaving time. The majority of schools in this borough are not state. The majority of healthcare is not state. It costs an absolute fortune to live in Kensington because you've got to pay for your own welfare state as well. So they're all incredibly scared of being taxed more. The taxes are going to rise. If we're going to predict anything, given how much they've been saying that taxes are going to rise, there will be increases in taxes in the budget. The amount of that rise required to remove the limit on children receiving benefit is tiny. Yeah. The few billions, those taxes are going to be rising for paying for a lot of other things as well. Mainly, I suspect, for healthcare. Healthcare is mainly used by the elderly, people like me, I'm 57, that's old, and mostly by the middle class who live long enough to actually sit there in NHS hospitals in their 80s. And that's what the taxes are going to be rising for, that state pension. The amount of money it takes to reduce to get rid of the two-child limit and the cap on larger families is minuscule in the scheme of things.
I remember when the Conservatives decided to get rid of, to means test child benefit.
Yeah.
The Labour Party at the time, in opposition, I remember them very clearly covering this, saying, no, don't do that. And I was surprised, because I thought, well, the Labour Party would probably say, well, if you can afford not to have it, you shouldn't have it. But no, they said there was a benefit to having everybody getting something out of the welfare state.
Yeah.
That if everyone gets something out, you're more likely to be inclined to pay in. Is there an argument then that everyone should get a bit more out of the welfare state?
I think that's true. And I think, I talked to the Child Poverty Unit, who are writing the strategy at the moment, and suggested a national system of exchanges. So I volunteer at a children's exchange where there's no money involved and it's good for the environment, and you just swap. It's like a swap shop. And you can save hundreds of pounds in there in a month just by free swaps of things. And particularly the most expensive children are either teenagers or toddlers, because everything gets messed. And it's, you've got often a parent who's at home dealing with a toddler as well, so you've lost that income. If it's accessible to everybody, and it's an accessible service, which is what a lot of the Scandinavian countries have, they get much more out of the system, even though they put in more. Yeah. There's generally a feeling of okay, give and take. The problem is, as you say, if the middle classes are giving everything, or feel like they're getting more, and then they don't feel like they're getting the benefits.
But you feel like I can remember. I'm from an upper middle class family. Right, this is Rising East Oxford. I can remember age 6, 7, 8, and 9 being dragged along by my mum and my three brothers to the post office every week to go and get whatever the benefit was.
Family allowance.
Right, and you and it was always the mums, but you and everybody else went, and you were part of something, and it made sense, because all that happened is that my mum and dad paid a little bit more taxes.
Yeah. I remember getting that as well.
Yeah,
I remember it, and I remember being given it actually when I was in my early teens to make me budget.
Yeah.
That was all I got. But it helped. Gosh, it really helped. Right, let's have some questions from the people. I've asked lots of questions. We've got a couple of people here. Do you want to ask a question before I start? Have we got a microphone?
There is one there.
Oh, it's here. Sorry, I'm being lazy. Thank you. Sorry, I'm dropping my own now. Gosh, this is no good at all. Are you coming to get this, Mitchell? Thank you. Sorry, folks. Oh, you've got one. All right. I'll just...
That's the emergency one.
That's the spare, it says.
Is that what she said?
It's called the spare. Please speak right into the microphone so we can hear myself. Nice and slowly, because the echo in here is quite bad. Thank you.
I'll try that. I'm on the road. So it sounds like what you're describing is the need for something which kind of persuades all of society this is a problem. And I guess the challenge in listening to what you're saying is that politicians aren't engaged because those who are in poverty are less likely to be engaged or vote. Do you think that's kind of part of the problem? If so, how do you get around that? In the sense that politicians will, I think, do what they think will work best for the electorate. So how to educate that actually is something that they should be doing, they should prioritise?
I have a go first. I think they desperately need, the current government desperately needs something that they do that people think they've done well. because they've managed. I mean, to be fair to Keir Starmer, he is the most unpopular Prime Minister ever, but that was the same for Sunak, and then going back, all the way back to Blair, each one became less popular than it ever happened. So we're in an era of disbelief in politicians. But it isn't just that, Keir says this really matters to him, but they're not going to get themselves out of the doldrums just by saying they're going to blow small ships out of the channel. Right? It's not, despite the fact that it's completely immoral anyway, it's not going to win them the votes that they need. The large majority of very poor people in this country live in Labour constituencies because there are so many Labour MPs. And they need to hold on to the votes that got them in. But so many other people are so close to this poverty line. You're talking 9 children out of 30 in a classroom. And there will be another 9 there but for some bad luck at work, a recession, illness or a divorce. And the next 9 out of 30 could be poverty. And suddenly you've only got yourself, 12 children left who probably won't experience poverty. But if they go to a mixed school, most of their friends... It's a bit like that point when the majority of children, most of their friends, mum and dad split up while they were at school. You know, we never thought that would happen. You don't want to be in a society where unless you segregate your children away from other children, they're going to grow up with friends in poverty. It's not needed.
Guys, there's a question. Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a question here. Why do current school systems unintentionally reinforce stigma, for example, through means testing, free school meal queues or uniform policies? And there's an allied question here, I suppose, where talking about London offers universal free school meals for primary pupils. Has this been evaluated and does it provide a compelling case for wider national adoption? I don't suppose schools set out to cause that sort of stigma, do they?
I think they're just surviving. You know, I mean, our school's got my daughter's school looks perfectly fine, but they've not got the funds to replace things. I think that you look at the fact as well is that the more kids you have in poverty in a class, the more difficult they are going to be to educate, because they've got the trauma response that they're dealing with, and they're bringing all of that stuff from home into the classroom. So I have a huge amount of sympathy and respect for teachers and the teaching profession and what they're having to deal with. Because until you actually are in a classroom with 30 kids and you see what they're capable of and what the teachers have to deal with, I think it's quite hard to comprehend. So I have a lot of respect for the schools. I think they're right on the front line of
We've also
policy.
been dealing with the fact that the threshold for free school meals is £7,400. And that means that there are 1 million children who are in poverty who don't even qualify. And so schools are having to sort sheep from goats to get this minuscule amount of money. It's not even enough for a meal. So if you're a child on a free school meal, you can have a main course and a drink, but you can't have something else, can't have fruit as well, because there's not enough money. So you're very visible. Schools have tried to be kind of clever and do electronic systems, but everyone still knows. Because they can see the amount comes up. It's the free school meal amount.
We may remember the free school meal tickets, and then Heidi, you had a free school meal ticket.
Yeah, we had them.
The school my children went to, which I can say now that my youngest has left, trying really hard to help, but they called the children on free school meals were called scholars. This is a state school, right? They call them scholars. They also get to go on school trips for free. And the children were used to the idea that, so they're known. And the word scholar comes back 100 years to the University of Oxford, when the students were either scholars or gentlemen. Right? And this is going back in time. And then this idea of charity for... Right? And we don't notice we're doing it. We were better in the past. And we'd almost got to a point, because we got with the soup kitchens, we'd almost got to a point where you didn't need to have these divisions between people.
So just about the London schools where the primary school kids all get university, has that been evaluated?
Yeah, we were part of the evaluation of it. We did a qualitative survey. It made massive difference to parents. They were hugely positive about it. The schools were hugely relieved. I mean, you basically, meals become the centre of the school day. You can do other things. You can have music, poetry readings, everyone sitting down together. It's hugely beneficial for the school. Yeah. The universal free school meals is absolutely the answer to this, sort of stigmatising in schools. We were talking about sort of Finland and Sweden. I remember talking to a Swedish professor once about this sort of thing. You know, you say, do you have after-school clubs? What do you mean? Where kids can stay a bit longer because their parents work. Oh no, we always have extended hours. Otherwise it would be sex discriminatory, wouldn't it? Oh my God, it's just assumed. This kind of universal provision is just assumed. Yeah. Where we're sort of scrabbling away at sort of extending meagre supports, which is, and yet at the end of the Second World War we created the welfare state where we had more debt coming out of our ears, miles more than we have now. We made a political decision that we wanted to be a different kind of society, and that's what needs to happen. And what we're all saying about taxation, we need more progressive taxation. Income tax is actually the most progressive form of taxation.
And so it's applied to, right?
And we can't have these kind of high level of services that we want
on
American level of taxation.
But go for the people avoiding tax. Aggressively go for tax evaders and avoiders. Yes. The public will enjoy that. And it's more really by anyway.
So I'm slightly alarmed that I've been asked a question.
Oh.
Good.
And I'm in enough trouble most of the time. But here we go. Martine, what role do you see the media playing in perpetuating or challenging the shame narrative around poverty? Well, I would say, and I think I can say this without fear of contradiction, potentially lots.
Yeah.
It's about how we frame it, isn't it? And about how we invite people to tell their own stories about how they're struggling, and not to make them sound like they're the victim, but we often use individual stories to illustrate a wider issue. And if we allow people to tell their own story, then I hope that that's not adding to the shame of things, but just to illustrate the struggles that people have. And if we don't do that, but speak for them, then that's open to, quite rightly, to criticism too. So I think the answer is, yeah, we can make a difference in either direction.
But
if that's
also,
good enough.
so with journalism, a lot of people say it's quite a middle class profession because you have to do a lot of unpaid work to then become a journalist. So you're losing a lot of those working class voices automatically within the profession, just because, you know, any job that requires unpaid work to get a paid job, if you're living in poverty, you're not going to be doing it.
No.
But also people have these policies applied to them without any explanation about why it's happening. I don't think anyone was told, by the way, if you're a low-income working family, you're going to be made really worse off. You don't get a letter through the post saying, by the way, you know, the level of your benefits is being suppressed for the next 14 years. So there are a lot of people disillusioned with politics who, if you'd ask any of them in the street, what's the problem? I haven't got enough money, they'll tell you straight away. Cost of living's too high. But they've no idea why they're struggling so much. And this story has not been told by the press. The story about this poverty-producing period I talk about has not been told by the press. We hear about pensioners constantly. Pensioners are half as likely to be poor as children.
Is there an argument then for some kind of triple lock? Like we were talking outside, just to be transparent with you. When we were out in the green room, which isn't green, we talked about, you mentioned it, didn't you, Helen, that there's a triple lock to keep pensioners at a certain level. I mean, it would be a bold change, but some kind of minimum guarantee.
Save the Children were talking about bringing that up as a kind of issue, saying, because the pensioner poverty has fallen quite significantly. So could you then do a triple lock with child benefits in order to make sure they rise either 2.5% or with inflation, so that people aren't getting effective cuts in their incomes? Depends on how much that would cost. But I think we do need those more innovative thinking about this, because obviously the two-child benefit cap and two-child benefit and the benefit cap issues are serious issues. But I would like to see more from the government, more holistic thinking around this topic.
So it's difficult though, isn't it? I mean, we're not making excuses for any government, but it's difficult when you've got these sort of siloed departments, which, I mean, we've seen it with prisons, haven't we? That the Ministry of Justice looks after one bit, and then the Home Office looks after another, and then if they don't talk to each other, then it doesn't happen.
But that's communication.
And they've had a long time out of government. I mean, the Resolution Foundation produced a statistic that 57% of children with brother and sister, are going hungry several times a month, serious hungry. That's Torsten Bell. He's now, is he a minister?
Treasury Minister.
He's Treasury Minister. The government have had 14 years in opposition where all you can really do is talk to each other about what you plan to do when you get in. Right? The idea that suddenly they can't cope, it's silly. And they must be becoming frustrated now. To lose half your support in 12 months, to be facing a far-right party which at some point polls as much as the Conservatives and Labour together, you do have to think we're going to have to do something a bit different at this point. And a bit different might be the thing you promised you're going to do when you manifesto when you came in. And the easiest one, child poverty is the easiest because it's the least people, and nobody in their right mind blames a child for being poor. Right? So it's the low-hanging fruit.
So if we reframe poverty not as a personal failure but as a policy choice or even a policy failure, how might that shift public will and political courage to act? It's about reframing things, isn't it?
And that's the thing that I talk about in the book, the fact that we need to just completely reframe poverty and talk about, what creates and maintains it. And that it isn't always just about individual personal failure and the concept of the undeserving poor and coming out of, this has been that the concept of the undeserving poor is so useful for lazy politicians. If you can be a politician and blame poverty on their own bad decisions, you don't have to do very much. You know, you can earn 90 grand a year, very nice, plus a bit of extra, depending on whether you've got a duck pond or not, you know, all that. So, you know, I just think that the disillusionment that there is in the Labour Party, with the Labour Party now, in part is because I think everybody just thought that they had new ideas and that they were going to do stuff quickly.
But it's one thing to be in opposition, though, isn't it? It's another thing to actually have to enact it and then to be dealing with, you know, the cost of everything. And again, if a lot of people will say, I don't want my taxes to go up. I don't care, you know, what the reasons are for it. I don't want to have to pay any more tax.
So you can either put them up now, or you can wait till a year before an election when it gets so desperate to put them up and definitely lose that election. I mean, I don't know what I'm missing here.
That brings me to how can advocacy organisations like yours, Alison, best hold government to account and keep child poverty on the political agenda out of an election cycle? I mean, we're coming up to a budget, so you've been no doubt pressing your argument very, very forcefully.
Yeah. Well, we were pressing the argument very forcefully before they got elected. I mean, so we've been working on this one for a very long time. So we knew that there was going to be a child poverty strategy because we got it into the manifesto. So we went to the Labour policy forums and made sure it was debated. At one stage, it's interesting this, in 2010 they passed the Child Poverty Act just as Labour was leaving office, and it had all party support. That's what you need to get back to. And it was reneged on quite quickly when it became difficult.
Isn't it the power of if you've got politicians who are persuasive?
Yeah. Well, I think they need to tell the story. It's all about story, isn't it?
Yes, whichever party they're from.
Yeah.
Effective politicians are persuasive politicians.
Exactly.
If they wanted this enough, they would do it. You know, if politicians really wanted to do this, they would be able to communicate it properly. I think so much of this is about political choice, and that's why the public are so frustrated, because I think they know that.
To be fair to them, there's quite a lot to deal with, to be honest, and this is why they want growth, so that they can have more money to spend. I mean, 50 billion has been taken off families with children. We're asking for, 3.5 billion back as a first step, as a bare minimum.
I think
that's what the two-child limit would be. People aren't saying immediately restore all that money families have lost. And going back to the uprating mechanism, in social security there's always been an uprating mechanism. It used to be that benefits went up with RPI. Back in 2010 they reduced that to CPI. So people on low incomes were on a downward escalator when everybody else in society was on an upward escalator. That's what's been happening to the incomes of those people. So yeah, things like double lock forced them to do, and lots of people have argued for this for years, and maybe pension should also have a double lock other than triple. Controversial. Which basically you pay the higher of wages or prices. And that keeps benefits in line with living standards. Exactly. Yeah.
If you could each implement one urgent policy change tomorrow to reduce child poverty, what would it be, Helen?
I want a national system of exchanges, because I think that will be on the high street, it's very visible, it's open to everybody, and it's very practical support for parents. And they act as hubs as well, because there's a lot of parental loneliness that it adds to the stress as well, because poverty is very socially isolating. So for me, I know on the ground that works.
Is there a movement that's trying to get that off the ground?
It's just me.
It's just you.
It's just me.
Okay.
At the moment.
All right.
I'm trying. We'll see what
We've got to start somewhere. Danny, one thing you would urgent policy change tomorrow.
I actually have seen an exchange working in a town in the Cotswolds, not a rich town, but it's amazing.
It did work.
I thought it was a film set when I went there. I thought they put all these people on because they were and it wasn't. What it was you could get toys for your kids, you could get everything, and there were people turning up to dump stuff, people coming to get it, and you could all get a meal. There's only one choice. You could see it cooked in front of you, and there was a price, but if you couldn't pay, you just still went up to a till and they pretended you paid, and it was brilliant.
How did they fund it?
It didn't cost anything because it's all mutual exchange. So
the food cost something.
the meal ticket cost about £2 more than the actual food. So as long as only 1 in 5 people was going, so it was done like that.
Yeah, a bit like the free coffee thing.
Yeah, so it could work in a not rich town in the Cotswolds.
So what's your one policy change?
End to child limit and the benefit cap.
I thought you'd say that. And Alison,
I'd have to say that is the bare minimum first step for any child poverty strategy. They cannot leave office with more children in poverty than when they came in, and if they don't get rid of it, that's what's going to happen. It's 4.5 million now, it'll be 4.7, 4.8 when they leave, unless they get rid of the 2-child limit.
there are some of the questions that have been posted some time ago. Have you got your question as well? Sorry.
I do, yes.
I beg your pardon.
It kind of touches on what you've been speaking about. There's been a lot of talk about spending. I think you alluded to it. That'd be the one big policy lever you pull. Kind of related to that, what like would be the other thing outside of spending? So, Dan, you spoke a little bit about the structural inequality that kind of exists. You spoke a little bit about the reporting mechanisms as well. I think you touched on like the holistic view of this, and I'm quite interested because someone like is it something structural in the UK, for example? Is it some of the shaping of our economy? We're a more sector-orientated economy. Is that something to do with it as well? And we have fewer people meeting from different strata in society, etc. So yeah, to kind of sum up, what would kind of the lever be outside of spending?
I can give you another lever. I mean, most Western countries are 80% service economies now. Where we are odd is housing costs. And the majority of 1 in 3 children in England are living in private renting, the most expensive tenure, and they tend to be the poorest. Anything that reduced the amount of money that parents are spending on housing, say by 1 or 2% a year, would be a massive uplift. And all that requires is a bit of rent regulation, which most of Europe has. Dead easy. It means, this really annoys landlords, but landlords are only about 3% of the population, and they're pretty well off, and some are pretty well off. Less holidays for landlords, lower rent for the parents of the poorest children. When we brought in the should hold tenancies in the 80s, it was never supposed to be for children. That wasn't the plan. You can be evicted with 2 months' notice. That's 1 in 3 of our children, most of our poorer children. So structurally, there's lots of structural
That's literally just changed.
Yeah, but you've got to make it as good as exists in other European countries where literally, I could own a flat and I could rent it out, but I'd be renting it out under social housing provisions. I couldn't evict the people in it, as long as they pay. I can't set the rent. It works in other European countries, and it reduces poverty.
But property prices are so high that landlords have bought expensive properties, and so it's all part of that same thing.
It's going to take some decades, and those house prices have to come down. Yeah. But the people who are going to buy them don't exist. Over half our children have gone to university. In fact, almost 2/3 by the age of 30. They've got the biggest debts in the world. Well, not USA, most of them beat some cases. They're not going to be able to get the mortgages to buy our houses, so our houses are not worth...
But their student debts aren't taken into consideration for mortgages, are they?
They've still got to be paid back. It's not made up money.
Eventually.
Yeah, officially they're not. But, okay, supposing I've got a house worth $500,000, whoever's going to buy the house for $500,000, if they're going to be paying $100,000 back, which you pay on kind of being a nurse with a degree, that $100,000 cannot be spent on my house, no matter what anybody says about taking it into account.
The other thing that's happened is that in universal credit, the local housing allowance has been restricted to the 30th percentile of rents. And so given that so many people, as you say, are living in the private rented sector where rents are very expensive, no one anymore gets contribution towards their rent. Anything like what they actually pay, it's a tiny contribution.
This is all geography, right? This is all you've got to do is just look at other countries geographically and just say, how do they do it? Is it better and worse than us? Yeah. And we have this thing of thinking, we're only going to look at ourselves, we do a policy review where we just talk about us. And we've got a whole continent.
Just quick, you started with some positives.
Yes.
How you look back and said, look, we've done it before, we can do it again. Yeah. So just going to end on this. Give us a glimmer of hope, where you think the hope lies.
For me, it would be, actually, I don't think you should be able to inherit £9 billion without paying proper tax. I think if we change that, that would be a good thing. I think actually looking to the super rich as well and trying to make sure that people appreciate that actually having enough is okay. You don't have to be a multi-millionaire to have a happy life, and changing that kind of. But the tax system for the very rich has got to change.
Yeah. 100 years ago, we took the country houses off the aristocracy and we went from the most unequal to the second most equal country in Europe apart from Sweden. We had the most progressive housing system in the world. The majority of children in the 40s live in a council house. Never been done before. The most progressive education system in the world and the best health service in the world with the lowest child mortality. We've done it all before.
People won't give this up lightly, though, will they? And they feel that if it's been earned by their family, they should be entitled to pass it on.
9 billion wasn't, but also...
Well, they should be entitled to pass it on how they would see fit. It's about personal choices, about private education, private medicine.
Yeah.
It's your money, you spend it how you like.
And that's less than 5% of them. Yep, there are some people who will fight tooth and nail to keep what they've grabbed, and there's another 95% of us.
Maybe they've not grabbed it, maybe they've earned it.
Worked really, really hard, yeah.
They could evidence it, I'm sure, Danny.
There's also Patriotic Millionaires, which is an organisation which is saying, tax us, we want a fairer society.
Alison, glimmer of hope.
A glimmer of hope is that the government is working on a child poverty strategy. We don't know what it's going to be yet, but, if it's rigorous, like last time, if it has binding targets, if it's ambitious, if it's led from the top by the Prime Minister, if they resource it, and they have to invest in social security because that's the way they'll make a difference. And that's investing in the people of this country. It's investing in the children of this country, and they need to do that. And we know that child poverty is enormously policy responsive if you do that. So they've got to get on with it.
I know not everyone will have agreed with everything you all said tonight, but thank you for talking to us about child poverty. That brings us to the end of our event. I hope you found it illuminating. On behalf of the Royal Geographical Society, I would like to thank Alison, Danny and Helen for their insights. Thank you for attending here in Loud Large. You had the choice of seats. Thank you to you for joining us from wherever you are. Hope to see you online or in person again very soon. Have a good evening.